Hi, this is Dr. Miller. By now you should have a pretty good idea of what we mean when we talk about the logic condition. One of the conditions an argument must meet in order for us to consider it good. For an argument to meet this condition, the premises must actually support the conclusion in the sense that if they were true, we would in fact have good reason for thinking that the conclusion was true as well. But how do you decide if the premises really do support the conclusion? How do you actually evaluate an argument once you've analyzed it and put it into standard form? The first step is to decide what kind of argument it is, to determine whether it's a deductive argument or an inductive argument. Look at these two examples. Argument A. Dom Perignon is a type of champagne. All champagne is made in France. Therefore, Dom Perignon must be made in France. Argument B. Most people with steady jobs are honest and reliable. My grandfather had a steady job. Therefore, my grandfather was probably honest and reliable. In argument A, notice the words must be in the conclusion. These words indicate that the arguer is making a very strong claim about the relationship between the premises and the conclusion. If the premises are true, she's saying, it's guaranteed that the conclusion is true as well. It would be logically impossible for the conclusion to be false. In other words, she's implying that if you agree that the premises she's putting forward are plausible or true, you must, as a matter of logical necessity, accept that the conclusion is plausible or true as well. Now look at argument B. Notice the word probably in the conclusion. It indicates that in this case, the arguer is making a somewhat weaker claim. She's saying that the premises provide some support for the conclusion, but not absolutely conclusive proof. They make it probable or likely that the conclusion is true, but they don't amount to an absolutely certain demonstration that it is. In effect, she's making a more limited claim in this argument than she does in argument A. She's admitting that there is at least some possibility that the premises could be true and the conclusion false, even though she thinks they are sufficient to give us good grounds for accepting the conclusion. These examples illustrate the difference between two fundamentally different kinds of argument. Logicians who study critical thinking use the terms deductive and inductive to mark the distinction. Arguments like example A, where the arguer claims or implies that the conclusion follows from the premises with absolute necessity, are classified as deductive. Arguments like example B, where the arguer claims only that the premises make the conclusion probable or likely, are classified as inductive. You may have encountered the terms deductive and inductive before. If so, there's a good chance you might have heard them explained somewhat differently, using definitions that were common in an earlier era. But modern logicians use these terms to signify the kind of difference I just described. A difference in the degree of support the arguer claims or implies he is providing for his conclusion. If he claims to be giving an absolute proof, it's a deductive argument. If he claims only that the premises make the conclusion probable or likely, it's an inductive argument. When we classify an argument as deductive or inductive, we aren't actually evaluating it. We aren't saying whether it's a good argument or a bad one. Some deductive arguments are good, others are bad. And the same goes for inductive arguments. We're just describing it as falling into one category or the other. This is an important step since the standards we use when evaluating deductive arguments are different from those we use when evaluating inductive ones. But the actual evaluation is something that comes later, the next step in the process, so to speak. We'll be discussing how to evaluate each type of argument in the weeks ahead. For now, the important point is just for you to understand the difference between deductive and inductive arguments. Also, of course, for you to be able to determine which category any given argument falls into. If you see words that imply logical necessity in the conclusion, you can take this as a sign that the argument is deductive. For example, words like necessarily or must be, or in the case of negative conclusions, cannot possibly be, usually indicate that you're looking at a deductive argument. On the other hand, words like probably, or it is likely, or unlikely that usually mean that the argument is inductive. Arguers don't always include words like these in their conclusions, and when they don't, it can be a bit difficult to determine which category a given argument falls into. In some cases, the context of the argument will offer clues. If someone is trying to prove a theorem of geometry, you can assume that the argument they're giving is deductive, even if they don't use words that indicate logical necessity in formulating their conclusion. On the other hand, if someone is trying to convince you that one brand of cell phone would meet your needs better than another, you'd probably be right to assume that their argument is inductive, even if they don't use words like probably or likely in their conclusion. What if the context still doesn't make it clear whether the argument is deductive or inductive? In that case, you'll just have to say that the argument type is undetermined because the arguer's intentions are unclear. In practice, this means that you'll have to evaluate it both as a deductive argument and as an inductive argument, since it could be interpreted as falling into either category. But more on that point later.